And to open their case on the topic that this House believes that the West should assassinate Vladimir Putin, I will now welcome Saxon Taranto from Melbourne Grammar to take the podium.
Ladies and gentlemen, Russians are suffering. The world is suffering because of one delusional, egotistic, psychopathic man. I can, of course, only be referring to Russian President Vladimir Putin. I put president in heavy quotation marks because he's truly not. He is indeed, rather, a dictator who is currently attempting genocide, and a man for whom the West greatly needs to deal with. And we believe that on our side of the House, the West believing that we should assassinate Vladimir Putin is the only path to achieve this. It's important for this debate to establish some context around Russian politics, for which I will now give you in my setup. The Russian presidency is not upheld by Vladimir Putin. It is owned. Different from a real president, Putin is not acting for an organization. He is running his own administration, which him as leader, CEO, manager, judge, jury, and executioner. Without him, the entire Russian government, a toxic, sinister organization, collapses. An event which is immensely beneficial for the rest of the world and for Russia, which I will now prove in my substantives. It's firstly important to acknowledge that this is entirely beneficial for Russian people, right? Russian people are suffering in the world under the tyrannical reign of the Putin administration, right? The collapse of this administration would greatly benefit Russians. Why is this true? This is true for two reasons. One, Russians, in general, are against the abhorrent policy that this man promotes. The invasion of Ukraine, most Russians, as we have seen, as Russian military officers and citizens come out on various social media, usually risking their lives, we see that the consensus is that Russians are morally opposed to what their president does. No, thank you. And secondly, and most importantly, it arouses Russians to actually be in a stable place in the world. With Putin, they cannot achieve this. We see so much animosity globally towards Russia. We see this socially in Russian hate pushes. Further, we see it economically in the crippling sanctions that the West has imposed upon Russia as a result of the Ukrainian conflict. Quite literally, this all goes away when the Putin administration is destroyed. And the only way the Putin administration is destroyed is the assassination of its CEO.
On that?
Yes, I'll take you.
Did the assassination of Al-Qaeda stop terrorists from committing mass atrocities?
There's definitely parallel examples that we can draw to this, and Al-Qaeda is a valid one. There's an important thing to consider here is that Al-Qaeda and the Russian government are very different organizations. The biggest difference between them is Al-Qaeda is a far less organized organization, which means that at any time, with the death of their leader, they can elect a new one, okay? It's an organization that is mostly running in unity with a shared goal. The Putin administration is very different, is that they are acting as almost an alien body controlling the Russian people. And Putin is at the head of this company, if you will, not because he's been elected or put there or people support him, is because he literally owns the company. He is not supported or put in this position electorally. He owns it. So I don't think the comparison holds up at all. Onto my second substantive, rather. And this is the really important thing, right? Our side of the House achieves the only benefits for the rest of the world and Russia. Beyond any abstract moral principles, which we will touch on in a second, our House achieves genuine practical benefits for the rest of the world, which I'll now explain, right? In and beyond Russia, the entire world receives genuine benefits from the death of this sadistic leader. The obvious one is the pulling out of Ukraine, right? Saving potentially tens, if not hundreds of thousands of lives, right? We see Russian military forces and personnel have revealed that within this year, on various social media sites that this is not a war for Russia. It is a war for Putin, right? The opposition has a great burden to prove in saying that we should spare one psychotic man's life who has done atrocious things attempting genocide over the lives of potentially a million innocent Ukrainians who are suffering. It allows the West, and secondly on this mechanism, it allows the rest of the world to develop genuine, healthy relations with Russia, which we see in forms of trade lines and like social unity, right? You get immense global unity that is amended once Putin is assassinated, right? Yes, I'll take you in a minute. You save potentially millions of Ukrainian lives. This is what is actually important in this debate. We can discuss all day the moral absolutism of do people deserve to die, and that's all well and good. But the really important thing to weigh up here is the practical, social, economic benefits and the lives of millions against the death of one evil man. I'll take your point.
Well, the day after Putin dies...
Apologies. As I said, this is what is important in this debate. It is important that we put the lives of innocents, we put the health of a nation, we put the truly respectable and humanitarian values over the life of someone who could not care less for them. This is what our house stands for, and for these reasons, we're very proud to propose.
So for first speakers, protected time is before 1 minute and after 5 minutes, and for second speakers, it is going to be before 1 minute and after 8 minutes. I'd now like to welcome the first speaker for side opposition to take the lectern, Joel Coburn.
Panel, because we believe in a world where we want to minimise the amount of innocent deaths, we are so proud to oppose. I want to do a couple things for you in this speech. Firstly, show that change will not occur. Here I'll do a bit of framing where we think the other team missed out on in this debate. Secondly, I will prove that this will only exacerbate the death and the suffering, but I'd like to begin by rebutting the first proposition speaker. We get this characterisation of Putin and the Russian state that it's this one egotistical, psychopathic man. Putin is the head of the snake, but it's not a one-man snake. We think this mischaracterises Russia, and in a country of 140 million people, we tell you that Putin is not Stalin, and that if he was hated by his people to that extent of which they are promoting this ideal for, his government, other governments, would already be trying to throw him out. We also get this idea that it's entirely beneficial for the Russian people to be without Putin. As I'll expand upon my second point of substantive, we think that killing a country's leader will actually embroil said country in more conflict and more death and more violence. Not a good thing, guys. To expand upon this, the Russian government, we get this idea that it will completely collapse under Putin's death. We tell you that this simply will not occur. Russia is a global superpower. It has existed as an idea since the 7th century CE, and we tell you that fundamentally one man's death will not be enough to conjure all of this destruction. Finally, we get this response to our POI that Al-Qaeda is far less organised than Russia, and that as a result it's much easier to elect a leader. Well, we tell you that because Russia is so much more organised, it will be able to respond to this death a lot more easier and treat the death of Vladimir Putin as if it is nothing. My first point of substantive, I'll explicitly correct the proposition to where we think this debate occurs. This will not change world outcomes. We tell you that the foreign policy of countries is not completely annihilated by one person, and that the proposition's whole case rests on the assumption that if he was assassinated, Russia would change. Putin is a bad guy, not groundbreaking stuff, but let me tell you, the next person up is not going to be better. There are 3 ways to prove this. Firstly, in Western democracies, governments rarely flip their foreign policy if a new party is elected. We tell you that this is evidenced in actions like the continuation of the border wall in the US, or the continuation of the lack of repealing of border policy in Australia from the Abbott administration. Thus, if in a 2-party system things don't change much, we can expect Russia's oligopoly to change even less, because the person who comes in will be from Putin's inner circle, and we'll have 220 years of watching Putin lead. Secondly, Putin from a Russian perspective has been effective. He's expanded their territory, he's mitigated the economic deceleration, and first and foremost, he's provided stability. I'll take a point of information now.
Would the opposition consider the invasion of Ukraine Putin expanding his territory?
We would. And from a Russian perspective, that is largely considered pursuing the national identity of Russia. It's pursuing hegemony within the Russian people, and that we think this is not a universally accepted thing, that it's the worst thing in the world. We tell you that in Russia, Putin is not maligned, he is not shouted at in the streets, he is not hated for this, and in fact, he is seen as a leader of stability and of strength. Thirdly, our third response is, what message would the new person changing the course of Russia give? Well, we tell you that it says that the West can control Russia and that Russia's allies won't trust Russia. We will tell you at second speaker that this looks like the relationship it has with BRICS and other key allies in society. Secondly, it tells us that the West are allowed to assassinate Russian leaders and get away with it. We think that this really will not occur. In a country so entrenched in pride and its ideals that it has fought the West in space and effectively in so many other countries through proxy wars, the direct killing of its leader will not change their actions because it ends their bid as a global superpower. Even if it is Mother Teresa that steps into the office the next day, her duty is to Russia, not her morals, so she will not change a thing. And if she tries, no one will listen. The military listen to Putin because ultimately their goals are aligned, and thus any new leader needs to appeal to these different groups in Russian society. I'll take a point now.
If you say that the military is undying to Putin, how do you explain military operations pulling out of Ukraine under moral basis?
I'd like to thank the speaker for their point of information. We tell you that for every one military operation that leaves Ukraine, 100 more join, and we tell you that the fraction of people that leave Ukraine under moral obligations are not really comparable to the hundreds of thousands of soldiers devoted to Putin. We tell you that fundamentally it won't be Mother Teresa, but one of Putin's best mates that enter office anyway. My second point of substantive is this will actually propagate the death and destruction.
Point of information.
Gee, I can't think of any other conflict where an assassination expanded a regional conflict into a world one, or something like that. We told you that the best scenario for the proposition is that we change nothing, but realistically we think we'll actually see more death and more conflict. We think that we will see more death and more conflict, and as our second speaker will expand upon, Russia will become less cooperative, and this extends to BRICS, other ex-Soviet states, and effectively not every non-capitalist government in the world, if your leader can just get shot on sight. We tell you that that's ultimately why we're having debate, because of the war in Ukraine, and that because this is the differentiating reason why we're having this topic and it's focused on Russia and not the Uyghurs in China or the Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar, we tell you that the outcomes to the Ukrainian people are the primary harm in this debate. So what do we see? Well, we see in this debate, under prop, Russia feeling like it needs to respond. We think this looks like increased military action in Ukraine, more boots on the ground, a greater justification for indiscriminate weapons, and ultimately 1 million more mothers never seeing their kids again, or 1 million more sons without their fathers, because Russia is unable to back down now. And even if it's not millions, it's still tens of thousands, it's still hundreds of thousands, which we don't want to accept. And we think killing someone's leader has and will lead to conflict, not just in Russia, but in direct action against states around the world. Best case, war, worst case, nuclear apocalypse. So for the lives of Ukrainians and innocent people around the world, we are so proud to oppose. Thank you.
Thank Joel for that speech. And I'll now welcome Phoenix to take the podium as seconder to the proposition.
Ladies and gentlemen, take a look around. Hospitals are being bombed, schools are being bombed, lives are being lost in Ukraine. Side opposition opts for a world where we continue to allow this to escalate. But on side proposition, we benefit all the stakeholders within this debate: Ukraine, the West, and even Russia. On side proposition, we prioritize the lives of millions of innocent citizens over the life of one terrible murderer. On side proposition, we achieve a better society. So proud to propose. So today in this debate, my first speaker came out and discussed with you the benefits for society. And later in my speech, I will be outlining the principal argument on why it is actually morally justified to assassinate Vladimir Putin, and also why it is the West's responsibility to do this. But before I continue my team's case, I'd like to make some points of rebuttal. So the opposition has come out with this argument that change would not actually occur. We wouldn't actually see any real reform if we do assassinate Putin. They've told us about how Putin is not the entire system of government, and because Russia is a superpower, things won't actually change that much. Rather, it will be replaced with a leader that will ultimately result in the same issues that we're currently seeing in today's society. They also discuss this idea that it'll exacerbate death and further suffering, as it'll ultimately not change the outcomes. We as proposition has a couple of responses to this. Firstly, we'd like to say from the get-go that Putin is the one with power. No, thank you. This is not comparable to other governments, for example, where we're overthrowing other presidents and replacing them. Putin in Russia is the one in control. We think that if Putin is assassinated, we will actually see systemic reform and change will actually occur with this. Additionally, to this point around exacerbating death and further suffering, as I outlined with you in my introduction, take a look around now. Look at what the world is like today. As side proposition, we want to prioritize short-term benefits. We will not continue to let this escalate, and we don't see any other solutions other than allowing the West to assassinate Vladimir Putin. We want to prioritize what the world has today. Yes, I'll take your point.
If the Russian government is not overthrown and Putin's right-hand man enters office, wouldn't you agree that this is a provocative action that will lead to worse outcomes?
We don't believe this will lead to worse outcomes. As I stated before, we'd rather prioritize short-term benefits. We think this is the best solution, and we'd rather prioritize saving the lives of millions of innocent citizens over sparing the life of one terrible murderer who's actually resulted in a lot of detrimental effects to society. So going on to my team's case, let's look at this principal argument about why it's actually morally justified. So I'll be splitting this point up into two main arguments. Firstly, why it's okay to actually prioritize the life of millions over one murderer, and secondly, why it's actually the West's responsibility. So firstly, let's look at the status quo and some context in this debate. We've seen, as I outlined to you before, how Russia and Ukraine conflict, no thank you, because of Putin, we've seen the deaths of millions of people. We've seen extreme damage and loss of lives, millions of casualties, and bombings of places like hospitals and schools. To put it plainly, proposition does not agree with this. We believe that we should prioritize the life of one versus millions of people. And weighing out the consequences, it's way better to see long-term and short-term benefits on side proposition. We believe it'll ultimately result in a better society for Russia, Ukraine, and wider society through saving this one life. Yes, I'll take your point.
Aren't the past activities in Ukraine symmetric over both sides of the house?
We don't believe that this is the case. We think that past activities, yes, they may have some effect, but we believe, once again, we should focus on the now. We should look at this principal argument, and we should believe that saving the lives of millions is what we should actually be prioritizing at this point in time and within this debate. Let's look at now why the assassination of Putin is morally justified. So let's look at this realist argument, this idea of an eye for an eye. On side proposition, we're not just looking at one life for another, but one life for millions of people. Let's look at the example of the death penalty. Around 42 states in America still allow capital punishment. If we think it's okay to throw people who've murdered, let's say 1 or 2 people, in jail and completely execute them, why is it not okay to execute someone like Vladimir Putin, who has killed the lives of many, who has not spared innocent lives and children in schools, people in hospitals? Why do we think it's okay to have things like the death penalty, but it's not okay to kill someone like Putin, who ultimately results in more detrimental effects for our society? We believe in saving lives in order for the greater good. Additionally, let's also look at this point of this moral argument as to why it's actually the West's responsibility to do this. So firstly, I'm going to split this argument into two main responses. Firstly, what has the West done with what we've seen in the past under this Russia and Ukraine bring conflict, and secondly, how the West can show support through continuing to opt for this motion on proposition's side. So firstly, with the idea of what the West has actually done. We've seen the West currently provides humanitarian aid to those suffering in Ukraine. We see them giving things like military equipment and food, and they've done things like sanctioned Russia. However, we still think that this isn't enough and people are still suffering. We know this is a fact, and we also think that side opposition will agree with this. But we see the motion and agreeing with the motion as a way to actually mitigate these problems. We see it as the simplest and best solution. So why should we continue to use up the West's resources when there is the simple solution of assassinating Putin? We believe the West has put some resources towards this, but the simple solution would be to assassinate him, as it would ultimately result in benefits for every stakeholder in this debate. Not just Russia, not just the West, but additionally also Ukraine. As my first speaker stated, some people in Ukraine don't even agree with what Putin is doing. We can acknowledge that they're also morally justified citizens, and they don't believe that, and we've seen with campaigns who have opposed their own government, that people don't agree with what Vladimir Putin is doing. Thus, we can see that everyone would benefit from actually assassinating him. We believe that through agreeing with the side proposition, we will reduce the amount of resources the West has to aid Ukraine with, which would ultimately result in a better society for everyone. Additionally, under side proposition, the West and Russia and Ukraine will also be benefited. Secondly, on the second motion of how the West can show this additional support, we've already outlined what the West has done, but as we stated before, the West can do more. So many people are suffering, and this humanitarian aid the West is currently giving simply isn't enough. This is a way for the West to take some responsibility. Yes, I'll take your point.
Is Russia a stable or turbulent country?
We believe Russia is definitely a turbulent country. However, we think that this can be obviously mitigated through actually assassinating Vladimir Putin. We believe that we can create some more stability within this country and within this nation through mitigating the root cause of the issue, through removing his power, as this is ultimately the government that needs systemic change and reform. This is the government that is causing the damage of many innocent lives around the world. We don't believe we should be prioritizing this kind of life. Yes, I'll take your point.
Well, if Putin does die and this does occur, wouldn't you actually agree that, well, does this not send a harmful message to Russia and its allies?
We don't believe this sends a harmful message. Once again, we believe we should be focusing on the short-term benefits of the now. We think assassinating Putin will ultimately result in saving the lives of millions of people. We think it'll be sending the message that yes, we should be taking accountability for our actions. We should be killing the people who are the ones who are not sparing innocent lives, the ones causing damage, the ones who are the root cause of the issue. And thus, we don't believe it's sending a harmful message, and rather one that would save the lives of many and ultimately boost the morality of the nation by spreading this principal argument that it is morally justifiable to assassinate someone like Vladimir Putin, who is a harmful murderer. So furthering this point, we ultimately believe as proposition we would better society, and it would be easier for the West to show their support rather than using up all their resources when it can ultimately have a simple solution. Assassinating Vladimir Putin will result in benefits for everyone in society. It will result in West using up less resources. It will result in Russia having a government that is actually stable, that is actually has the power to save other citizens, and it will result in a better society for those in Ukraine. So proud to propose. Thank you.
Thank you, Phoenix, for that speech. We'll now welcome Emily to the lectern as seconder for the opposition.
Panel. When at first we bring to you the devastating impacts that an assassination could have on the people of Ukraine, we thought that the burden was on proposition to prove why they got the same impacts on their side. On side opposition, we don't want to use people as political battering rams, causing the deaths of millions around the world. Instead, we bring to you the fact that we still get change and maintain our relationships with not only Russia, but other key stakeholders in the political sphere. But before I get onto my point about why we get better benefits on our side, I would like to bring to you the four main clashes that side proposition has brought up in this debate. The first is the principle, why killing Putin is morally justified. We think we can counter this principle by proving that we have more people that will die under side proposition's side. We believe this because Vladimir Putin's death causes more harm and detrimental impacts to how the Russian government is being delivered. And therefore we think that ultimately we believe that we can counter this principle based on the sheer numbers of the people that will be killed. But then, what is the West's actual obligation?
Point of information.
I'll take you later. We see that we minimize suffering for people in Ukraine and people in Russia because of the fact that we don't absolutely detriment their government. Instead, we ensure that our change is made incrementally, meaning that it will lead to less deaths overall. No, thank you. We think that there's no way that the side proposition could cause an assassination without having any sort of political outrage. And therefore we thought that the West's obligation was actually to make sure that political outrage was not something we had to contend to in the first place. I'll take one of your points now.
Don't you think that a toxic government who risks their lives and kills millions is worse off than having, for a period of time, a turbulent state?
I believe that's not true, and I'll prove to you in my next point, and I'll flag it when I do. So now let's talk about the benefits for Russian people. Why do we think that side proposition doesn't get this? 4 things. Firstly, we see that Putin's death will cause outrage. In Russia, there's a lot of nationalism, and there's a lot of sense that people enjoy or have an idea of what Putin is doing. This may not be true for all Russians, but it's definitely true for a majority of them because instinctively people do have a sense of nationalism. But we also believe that this is in the same way that any leader of any country experiences some sort of outrage when they're assassinated. For example, Archduke Ferdinand, who has made the entire nation of the country become incredibly outraged. But secondly, we think that there will be no actual substantial change because of the political system of Russia. Russia is an oligarchy. It relies on groups of very individualistic and very powerful people. It's not a monolith. Therefore, by only removing one person in this climate, we see that there's not going to be a significant change in the way that things are run. Thirdly, my first speaker has already proven that with the system under the Russian sphere, there's going to be no sense of systematic change because of the oligarchy. But fourthly, and most importantly, let's take side proposition at their best and say that the Russian government system is only reliant on Vladimir Putin's power, and therefore by getting rid of him, it will completely detriment their system. Why do we think this is incredibly detrimental? So we've already characterized Russia as being an incredibly turbulent state, meaning that if we take side proposition at their best and say that they have an incredible detrimental impact to their government, therefore completely demolishing the Russian government, we see that the government will completely dissolve. This is incredibly harmful for all of the stakeholders in the Russian government because it means that people in Russia are no longer able to have support and rely on a government that they needed in the first place. No, thank you. Russia is already incredibly vulnerable because of things like the Russia-Ukraine war. By adding these sorts of stresses on their government, it's going to be incredibly detrimental. So why don't they get both short-term and long-term impacts? We don't think they get short-term impacts because the collapse of the Russian government is going to be so detrimental because they don't have incremental change, but the Russian Empire will go from something that was stable overnight to something that is non-existent in the future. We see that in other countries where this has happened, such as the Soviet Union or World War II Germany, this has been incredibly detrimental. And instead, in the long term, we don't think that there is much impact because when countries are so incredibly devastated so quickly, such as the Soviet Union, they simply just fail to exist anymore. We instead get incremental change in the Russia-Ukraine war, which we think is ultimately much more beneficial because of the fact that we can stably change the government. But I'll take you now.
So proposition does concede that the death of Putin would inevitably lead to the collapse of the Russian government.
Yes, thank you for that point. I don't see how that was a question. So why would Russia still ultimately fall? In the status quo, we see that the West is intervening in Russia by sending military equipment. And note that this has already been working quite well. Russia has already weakened because of our current policies, and they've already lost some territory because of the fact that the West is intervening. Why is this good? 3 reasons. First of all, the West is still intervening and therefore fulfilling its obligation. We're still condemning Russia and saying that what they're doing is bad, but we're also not aggravating Russia to the point where they're going to have incredible harm and backlash. Secondly, we think there's a lot less aggression pushed by the West. It means that we don't get people killed because of the fact that we're not aggravating Russia and making them get incredibly aggravated by the fact that we are putting on the pressure to them. But lastly, we're not escalating the situation and causing more deaths. So ultimately, not only do we get change, but we also get the benefits of not getting more deaths and more instability overall. So then on the benefits of Putin not being there and like how pulling out of Ukraine will be actually good. So why do we think that this is not actually the case that will happen? We think that the Russia-Ukraine war not only relies on Putin's own interest in it, but also 2 other reasons. The first is Ukraine's incredible oil supply. Russia is a huge nation in like oil supply, and therefore we think that they have an inherent interest in Ukraine because of oil supply. Since Russia is also like quite dependent on its oligarchy, who are interested in money, we don't think that simply by removing Putin, just Putin, it will change their minds about like Ukraine's oil. But secondly, we think that sovereignty is something that is ingrained in Russian citizens, and it's not just Vladimir Putin who wants to pursue this. So by these 2 factors, we see that by getting rid of Vladimir Putin, you're not actually doing anything. But lastly, on global unity, my point is in direct response to this, so I'll move on to this. So practically, how does our world impact our relationship with other countries? I'd like to first start by characterizing a couple points. 3 things. Firstly, who are Russia's allies? We think these look like countries such as BRICS. Note that these people are quite bonded because of things such as trade, because they're all like developing nations who want to become developed nations. Secondly, we think it's smaller developing or autocratic nations, such as a lot of African nations such as Gabon. But secondly, what does Russia's political power look like? 2 things. It's quite turbulent in the sense that the Russia and Ukraine war was quite sudden. Vladimir threatened to nuke Ukraine. It is not a very stable country in that sense. But secondly, it has a lot of influence. It's a P5 country in the UN Security Council. It is a part of BRICS. It has a lot of economic power.
Point of information?
No, thank you. Thirdly, what are the West's interests? 3 things. First of all, we think it's trade in the sense that we have huge interest in China and Russia. Note that they are part of BRICS. Secondly, they have interest in keeping up international relations. This is in the same way that we see the West having incredible interest in things like the UN Security Council. And third of all, we see that they're stopping the war. Note, first, I already told you why this is important. So what does the affirmative world then look like? Firstly, we think Russia is less cooperative. By assassinating Vladimir Putin, we aggravate Russia because they are going to care that he was assassinated. It sets a precedent of unfriendly nature. But therefore, Russia will want to get back at the West. This manifests in things such as vetoing every resolution at the UN, cutting off the West's oil supply. These are incredible things that Russia will inherently do because they are a turbulent nation. But thirdly, we think by association, countries such as BRICS will be less cooperative. China backs Russia often, and by condemning their actions. And therefore, if we think we aggravate Russia, we also aggravate its allies. Secondly, we think Russia will be more aggressive because we think that compared to condemning Russia, assassination is a much more violent and aggressive statement that the West could impose. Since Russia is turbulent, as proven in my characterization, it will lead to them acting back in aggression. We think the impacts of this look like the threats of nuclear annihilation that Vladimir Putin has already given to Ukraine, but also increased attacks on Ukraine, which is incredibly detrimental to side proposition because their entire case hinged on the fact that the Russia-Ukraine war would end. But why is this bad? 3 reasons. First of all, it has detrimental impacts for international relations, trade is worse for proposition, and it leads to some form of suffering and deaths. Ultimately, we care more about our impacts because not only does it benefit stakeholders from proposition by not making the Ukraine conflict worse, but we also benefit trade and overall IR. Therefore, we have better impacts, and therefore, we are so proud to oppose.
Thank you, Emily, for that speech. Both teams now have 1 minute to prepare their reply speeches. I'll ask that the audience please keep noise to a minimum in this time. Okay, and that is time. Each team will now have 3 minutes to present their reply speech to conclude their side of the debate. During reply speeches, there are to be no points of information. We'll now reverse order for the reply speeches, and I will ask Joel Coburn to take to the podium to present side opposition's reply to the debate.
Side proposition cannot win today because they assume that in a Power 5 veto country, in a country with the second biggest military, the third biggest GDP, will just crumble under the death of one man. We tell you that regardless of whether it's the West's responsibility, whether or not it is moral, it will not do anything. I want to do two things in this speech. Firstly, re-establish the reality of this debate and analyse the level to which change will occur, and secondly, analyse the two worlds of the hypothetical futures of both sides. Firstly, will Russian change occur? Well, if it does follow and the government magically switches up, we tell you that the proposition loses this debate because all of their claims of short-term benefits in lives and the merger of accountability will be lost. And we tell you that this is where the debate dies. We tell you that if the side proposition lose this idea in the debate, that change does not occur, they lose the debate. We tell you that they failed to effectively mechanise this, and it's not just asserting that Putin is a one-man state. That's what they did. We don't buy this, and firstly, we think of the citizens were so severely oppressed. In 20 years of Putin's leadership, there would have been precisely more than 0 efforts for Russia's enemies to promote insurgency groups in the country. Secondly, even if we buy this, the Russian government is made up of Putin's lackeys and the most devout followers, and so his power, if it is so absolute, then after his death, his foreign policy will still live on. We gave you 3 layers analysis of why Russian foreign policy will not change. Firstly, we compared this to Western democracies, and because in Western democracies foreign policy doesn't really change, we think we'll see less in the oligarchy of Russia. Secondly, from a Russian perspective, Putin has been effective in providing more stability, expanded territory, and mitigating the economic destruction and deceleration of Russia. We tell you that the person coming in will actually try to emulate Putin. Thirdly, what message would the new person send? Well, we tell you that if they don't act provocatively and they actually change their foreign policy, it would look like the West can control Russia. And in a country which has fought so viciously over the space race and in proxy wars, we don't think that this is an outcome that they'll accept. The second clash in this debate are the two worlds, and contrary to the second proposition's idea on short-term benefits, we think in response to our own world, in the short term, it is more harmful on their side and the most harmful on their side. We tell you that who enters Russian presidency the day after he dies? Well, it's Putin's right-hand man, and this outcome is evident as the need to someone close to Putin to emulate him and to follow his conduct is going to happen. And we tell you in the long term, we also take this debate as we have more international cooperation and trade. We tell you at second that we have better cooperation through international relations are heightened, and we don't get the destruction of our dealings with China and with ex-Soviet states. And we also tell you that we get better trade outcomes by not maligning BRICS and increasing the gap between Western states and the rest. So, in conclusion, it's clear in this debate that Russian foreign policy has been moulded by Putin, but in his death it will not change because they don't want to and they don't need to. So for the lives of Ukrainians and innocent people around the world, so proud to oppose. Thank you.
I would like to thank side opposition for presenting their side of the debate. I will now ask Saxon to speak for side proposition and present their reply to the debate.
Three main ideas brought up in this debate. The first one, whether change will actually occur as a result of the assassination of Putin. Proposition says that change does not occur because Putin's right-hand man will simply come into government the second after he's assassinated. We tell you this is not true for 2 reasons. First of all, the Russian administration is owned solely by Putin, right? They compare it to a democracy, but it's kind of similar more to a monarchy. If someone is to assassinate King Charles tomorrow, the monarchy isn't going to replace him immediately with a new king. There is great historical debacle that happens, and it might actually result in the collapse of the monarchy. We think that this will quite literally result in the collapse of the Russian government. So things do not stagnate. They do change greatly. And the idea that things get worse is completely disputed by the fact that things can't change at all. So they kind of contradict themselves, but overall, the response to nothing happening disproves that. They then contradict themselves by saying that the Russian government does entirely collapse if Putin dies, which would initially be bad for the citizens. This isn't true because Well, a government that is actively causing its people suffering is actually worse than having no government at all, as weird as a proposition that is. They say that because Russia is powerful, a government collapse would be a bad thing. Well, yes, we do agree that they do have like insurmountable power, but this power is being like abused. It's being used in a fundamentally like immoral way, which we think it's better to take away from them in this moment than like risk them doing further worse things. They also mention like international relations. Well, the main thing that stops Russia from actually developing international relations outside of like old communist circles are in fact Putin being leader. I believe countries like the US, the UK, will be much more open to having Russians seen more as a friend than an enemy if the Putin administration was gone, which is another benefit that we receive on our side. We see the cost of Putin, right? We see like the opportunity cost of having Putin gone. We get exponential economic benefit for Russia with the removing of these sanctions. We get the social benefit for Russian citizens no longer having to exist under the tyrannical reign of a leader who does not care for them. And most importantly, we get the lives saved of millions of Ukrainians and the social reform for Russia's government in the future. Whereas the NEG has not only offered no real legitimate benefit for having the Putin administration exist, they've actually proved as to why it's bad, right? They mention that Russian pride in having a stable government is important. However, they fail to prove how this evil institution benefits anyone in comparison to having no government at all, right? Putin is actively acting against the will of like the Russian people. They use nationalism as an excuse, and they mention a comparison to Archduke Ferdinand. I think it's important to remember that Archduke Ferdinand had the support of his constituents. He was acting in the will of his constituents, which is completely opposed to what Russia is doing, acting almost against the will of his constituents. So we think this is like entirely erroneous to this debate at all. Putin is acting as a tyrannical leader, not for his citizens, but in fact against them. He is acting to kill the lives of Ukrainians. He is attempting genocide. We think there is no appropriate world in which he can go on existing as a leader. And the only way to achieve this, to achieve reform in Russia and the world, to heal long-torn wounds of global politics, is to assassinate him. Whether that be the hard knock or not, that is just what needs to be done. And for these reasons, we're so very proud to propose.